Expedition 44, here again with Matt and Ryan.
Hey, so in case you've been living under a rock, or it's your first time visiting us here at Expedition 44, Expedition 44 is a covenant community dedicated to cultivating a discipleship culture that's wholly devoted to King Jesus.
We have been on a long series on the church, and going to end up being our longest ever, probably at this point taking at least a year. Maybe it'll end up being 2 or 3 years, we'll find out. But we took a little hiatus, sort of, to do the book of James. Matt decided to teach the book of James in our church, and so we decided so much of it ties into the church conversation anyway that it fit with the series, so this is kind of a microcosm mini-series of the bigger series.
Yeah. So our last episode, we covered kind of some introduction stuff. We talked about James, the brother of Jesus. We landed on him as the author, though we explored some other Jameses in the Bible. He introduces himself as a servant of King Jesus, and not really as this major leader in the church. He comes off as presenting himself as a servant, a slave.
Humility.
Humility. Yep. So the letter was written, we believe, in either the late 50s, mid to late 50s, early 60s.
Some people even want to put it in the 40s, but we're a little careful going.
Yeah. So James was stoned to death 62 AD, so we know it's before then. So the recipients of this letter are probably majority Jews that were in the Church of Jerusalem.
And this is where I joke that, like, this is really, we read it James, which is really, you know, the Greek version of it, and it's Yaakov. And so I'm almost tempted, you're going to get into this today, there's a lot of Hebraic stuff going on in this writing, and so I'm tempted to do the whole thing in Hebrew today, Matt.
Okay.
I don't think I could, but but anyway, you got to think Hebraically with James, so that's what we're getting to.
Yep. Yeah, these were Jewish Christians, probably had a relationship with James, being in the church in Jerusalem with him, and now they're scattered.
So there are Gentiles going out here too. It isn't written just to a Hebraic audience. It's also a Gentile audience, and we kind of talked about that, scattered of the 12 tribes. Like James' ideology is already thinking, he's referring to these as the 12 tribes. Now, some people say, well, there's only 10 tribes. Like,
10 tribes scattered, yeah. So,
but in his mind, it's already there. And I like that because from the very beginning, that's thinking eschatologically, which we're going to get into today.
Yep, so the main three purposes we kind of are going to be getting into today in James, and it's the three purposes he keeps coming back to in his whole letter. They all fall under this theme of the law, the royal law, or the law of liberty, which we will get into. But the three things are how to face trials and the purpose of the trials, wisdom from above and not the wisdom of the world, and the love for brothers and sisters, to love your neighbor as yourself. So under that, James comes out a lot with how we speak and how we care for the poor, and no favoritism and no hierarchy, and those are some big themes.
And you're going to hear the hierarchy thing over and over, and we're going to sound like a broken record by the end of James here, because a lot of people have actually done the opposite of the intention of the book, of used James as a reason to put hierarchy into the church, where we see it exactly the opposite. It's a reason for leading submissively and the servant taking on the actual image of Christ in the way that you serve. So we're going to jump right in. James 1, 2, 3, 4. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. We practically have this memorized. Knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result. Boy, I love that he uses Jesus' mindset of holy, complete perfection here, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing.
All right, so James begins here, and we talked a little bit at the end of our last episode that the first 12 verses, 11 verses of James put these three items forward. He gives a summary of basically his letter, and then in the second half of this chapter, he dives in and nuances them a little bit, and dives a little bit deeper into each of those three. And then throughout the whole rest of James 2 through 5, we have 12 basically mini messages revolving around these three themes. So,
and I kind of like this because he thinks a little bit like I think. It's like this, we're going to lay this out, there's some good administrational thinking to it, but it's also a little bit abrupt and also kind of skittish, and that's why sometimes it's squirrelish, I'd say. And so that's why some people kind of have a hang up with it, but it actually fits Old Testament thinking really well.
Yeah, it's not like, here's three things, so we're going to go into our first thing here, and then our second thing here. He pieces these all together as kind of a mosaic, and then they all come together around these three themes throughout the rest of the book.
So Matt and I have been talking Hebraically, and what I mean by that, before we even start, I just want to lay out that kind of thinking. So we see things in Western eyes, very American, very me-ish. Everything rotates around me, where in a Hebraic way of thinking, it was really more about the community. So what we're going to get into is joy here. What does joy mean? And so today we have kind of more of a Platonic sense of joy. And so in this age, there's two Greek words that kind of talk about joy. One is kara and one is hedon. And it's usually those two, you see them interchangeable. So when you get into extra biblical sources, particularly hedonistic sources, that's where that word comes from, you're going to see those used together in hedonism. But what he's using them is that joy has more of a innate sense that stems into an eschatological sense.
Yeah, it's with not so happiness is based on circumstances that are right in front of you.
Yeah.
So whether you're happy or sad is based on circumstances that are happening in the here and now, right in front of you, today or in the recent past.
Yeah.
So, but joy is something that has a wider lens and something that's focused on the end, and so you can root your hope in something in the future, which doesn't mean you can't be happy or sad now, but it doesn't dictate the path of your life, because the joy, like as it said, Christ endured the cross because of the joy set before him.
Right.
Not that he was going to go enjoy being crucified,
Exactly.
but because he has a mindset fixed on the end.
Yeah. So hedonism, which is the way we think materialistically in America, would mean everything rotates around my well-being materially. Like, do I have joy in the sense of, am I going to be happy today? Where this describes more of the way C.S. Lewis described joy. And so you might get I can't remember the title of the book with joy glimpses or shadows or something like that. And the whole book is basically, showing that his relationship with his wife was essentially like a little snapshots of heaven, pictures of heaven over and over. And that's the idea that we get with James in joy. So it's associated with community, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. And so when James is talking Hebraically, it's actually the idea that you would get if you went to like a Jewish festival. It's associated with the life of the community. So in the Old Testament, this is described as the law is an object of joy. We think that's funny. We don't look at the law as joy, but Psalm 119 would tell us that we should take joy in the law. Another one is that the Word of God should be joy in our innermost being. And so today there's going to be several things that come out to this of, the Shema Matt mentioned in our introduction is heart, soul, mind kind of thinking. They didn't know what that was. They called it the gut most of the time in the Old Testament. But what is your innermost being should point to joy. There's also an idea that we get of a reward of being faithful. And that's huge in the Old Testament because they're going to live in faith. They know nothing else besides that. And so the reward is that as they live in faith, they're going to experience kind of cosmological joy here and now, but there's also something to be looked at. And they had no sense of the afterlife in the Old Testament, so that's what living in faith meant, that they would live totally in joy now, and in faith would look forward to what was to come as well. It's also interesting that weddings are described that way. And we're doing an Expedition 44 marriage conference down in Mexico. We leave in about 3 weeks, and I'm writing kind of a prayer devotional guide to go through it. And part of it is I'm talking about when Jesus turned the water into wine and the kind of what goes on between him and his mother Mary, and that we kind of read into that with, again, Western eyes. We kind of get like an argument, or we read tone into it, where that was actually the Greek word that he uses was incredibly intimate words. It was soft, it was tenderness words that came out of it, and we kind of lose that in translation. But the idea there is that this is joyful. And so when Mary comes to her son and pleads, this is like out of her ability to do it, but his response to her is really neat in that he basically says, what should we do? And so this is where did Mary turn the water into wine? Well, they had this really neat covenant connection where Jesus says, together, what should we do? And so we don't think about it that way, but that's the mindset that James is taking in this, is that there's a togetherness of Hebraic community that results in joy.
Yep. And so when he talks about trials here, is that these trials may be based on persecution. We talked a bit about persecution last time, and we know that Jesus blesses those who are persecuted in the Beatitudes.
Yeah.
In the Matthew 5:11 through 12.
Yeah.
He blesses those who are persecuted for his sake. And then Paul seems to kind of have the same view about what trials or what testing does in Romans 5, and it says that it talks about building perseverance and character and hope. So James and Paul kind of seem to be on the same page here.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different little word plays. A lot of times, we talked about this in the introduction, but the Greek of this is really smart, for lack of a better word. And so there's all kinds of things where we question, was that an intentional word play? Did he know what he was saying? Did he not know what he was saying? And there's part of that comes out in this kind of idea of being refined by a silversmith.
Yeah, dokimian is the Greek word there for testing, and it's the concept of that they'd use for silversmiths, where they'd put the metal into fire and it would melt, and through the melting, the dross or the impurities would rise to the top. They'd scoop it out, they'd heat it up again, the rest of it would come, and they would scoop it out. And so every time that it's heated up and through these trials, there's more purification that's happening. And so it's that same word that James uses here of the testing of our faith, and when we go through trials, produces, like Paul says, hope, character, perseverance within us, and that's what it accomplishes.
And a lot of people refer to this as James' beatitude, and the reason is because it sounds very similar to a lot of things that Jesus says. The branches need to be pruned, that the chaff of the wind blows away, that all these things, turn us into, through trial, tribulation, through better people for the kingdom of God.
Yeah, and then, so James lists three things that they accomplish: perfection, completeness, and lacking nothing.
We've talked about these a lot in Jesus. So this is a Jesus definition of being wholly complete.
Yeah, so we have a whole video on perfection, which isn't about this moral, box-checking absoluteness, but it's about wholeness. It's about he uses teleios here, which is the goal in a sacrificial context, is something that is fit to be offered to God.
Yeah. It's total service, humility. Again, like, when you put James in a hierarchical sense here, you miss all of this. You miss the Christ-like completeness and total sacrificial language of the Lamb that you would have been, goes way back into an Old Testament Hebraic way of thinking.
Yeah, and then he says completeness, which goes back to kind of that silversmith picture that we just painted. And then lacking nothing, which is basically a word that was used in the Greco-Roman culture to defeat an army or to overcome a struggle or to reach a standard.
Yeah.
And so that's what you said, these trials, though it might look like you're defeated, it's actually upside down. You're defeating the things in yourself through it that bring you to look more like Christ.
Like this tie. Our thing is Psalm 144:1, and it's actually very similar in that, like, the battle language is actually kind of anti-battle language in the Bible.
So it's actually through being defeated. So you say you actually win. So it's like Jesus dying on the cross to defeat the principalities and powers, and giving up your life, you win.
It's beautiful.
So let's continue. So that was James' first thing he talked about, which is how to face trials. His second one is found in James 1:5-8. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all generously without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without doubting. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man and unstable in all his ways.
So we have this idea of wisdom, and this is kind of contrasting wisdom of the world. Later we're going to kind of, get into the wisdom of the world, the wisdom of the Father, things like that. So this is one of my favorite things. It's wisdom, and we don't just learn what it is that we're going to do next. It's sometimes we kind of want, like, the GPS translation. This is, again, Western thinking, and so I want you guys to understand the difference between the way that James is writing this with an Eastern mind, Hebraically, and the way that we want to read it. Is we want to read it like the GPS Bible of, like, marry the girl in the blue dress, take the second left, this door will open. And a lot of times I hear people pray this way. Show me the golden fleece, And I don't want to say it's wrong, because there are some times in the Bible that I think it kind of opens the door for that way of thinking, but that's not really what James is kind of describing here. And so it's that would be a Greek James, and the Hebraic James is going to have more of like an Old Testament exhortation of wisdom literature. So what's the difference? How does wisdom literature kind of differ from the way that we think we want to read the Bible as in this kind of like GPS to tell us what to do?
Yeah, so here James exhorts us here is to seek wisdom, and kind of in the Proverbs mindset, it bases all of wisdom in God. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And we also have that in Psalm 111 and Proverbs 1:7 as well. That was Proverbs 9:10 I read from.
Yeah.
In Proverbs 8 and 9, it's really interesting. We have this kind of this rhetorical figure of Lady Wisdom, who is a co-creator with God and is calling out to people in the streets to basically follow her, be one, you know, in contrast with the ways of the world there. And then in the New Testament, we have this wisdom figure being like fulfilled in Jesus. The Word becoming flesh. Paul saying that Jesus is the wisdom of God in 1 Corinthians 1:24. Hebrews chapter 1 verses 2 through 3 has this, and Paul speaks of it again in Colossians 1:9 and 10. Jesus even talks about him being the wisdom of God in Luke 11:49 and Matthew 23:34, where he's basically kind of quoting from Proverbs 8 there and putting himself in that seat of him being that wisdom.
So what I want you to think about is, whether right or wrong, in the Old Testament, they thought that your heart was one way or the other, and you didn't have a whole lot to do with it. And so when you read the lev, the lav, the heart, all that in the Hebrew, what you're reading is that people would pray that their heart might be pure. They would pray that their heart might be with God. You might remember Solomon when he is asking for wisdom. I want you to go back and look at this because it's actually pretty neat. What he's actually praying for is that when you read it in Hebrew, he's praying that his heart might be found wise. That's what he prays for. And so it's we want to make it into this thing that it's like wisdom is like learning something, but the idea is that wisdom is something that's imparted that only God can give, that God gives you a new heart, a recreated heart. And so, you know, your heart, and this is where the whole book is kind of contrasting this worldly thing of that you have this heart that's the world's heart, but when you receive a new recreated sons of God idea, you become saints, holy ones, and that your heart is now wise or with God.
So after that, James kind of bases this request to wisdom fully on God's character. He says, the one who gives generously and without reproach.
Yeah, so this is an echo of Jesus' words in Luke 11, for the prayerful understanding. Which of you fathers, if your son asks for a fish, will give him a snake instead? Or if he asks for an egg, will give him a scorpion? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts for your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him?
Yeah, so kind of the thing here is James is getting at, how do you view God? Do you think of him as a distant father, maybe a loving father, a deadbeat dad, a wrathful ruler?
Oh, we talked about that one a little bit.
James is getting right to the heart here of this congregation of, you know what, part of who you are, you're going to, we all kind of image our fathers, you know, and we think of fathers in a certain way, and he's like, the way that people image God is the way they should be imaging the God that's revealed to them and not the God that they've made in their head.
Yeah, you know, my wife and I talk about this a lot. She grew up in Lutheran liturgy, and things were very sacred. Now, I have a lot of issues with the whole Lutheran faith, but like, I actually love that. Matt and I kind of go back to Orthodoxy a lot because we feel like there's an element of respect, reverence, awe for God that is just totally lost in the lights and the laser shows of today. Like, you can go to church where God is sacred and God is holy and exists, and you completely miss the sacredness of this. And so my wife was just saying yesterday, this is Monday, yesterday was Sunday, so it was a church day, and we went to our old church at the river. The music person, congratulations, Sean Panic, if you're watching, thank you for your well life served. And he sang some older, like, kind of hymnal songs for it. And by the way, when I was kind of going back to talking about these objects of joy in Joel 2, that's one of them, is singing hymns. And so today, when we lose the hymns, you're a worship leader, you know how this feels, like we miss that orthodoxy a little bit that brings the sacredness into it. So in Greek, again, this gets into a little bit of a wordplay, and we're going to get here where we're going to start talking about what religion meant when he talks about it. But the idea is that he's asking us to remain sacred, wholly devoted, and there's a little bit of an orthodoxy that comes with that request.
Yeah, and so what James does here is he does have a caveat. So he's telling people not to doubt, and I think when he's telling them not to doubt, sometimes this is used wrongly by word of faith people of that. But the thing that he's telling them,
this conversation.
The thing that he's telling them not to doubt is God's character. That God is one who gives good gifts.
Or Exodus 34 thing. Who is God?
So it's, remember, the fear of the Lord, or the respect of the Lord, is the beginning of wisdom, and much of wisdom comes from knowing God's nature. And so, Exodus 34, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness and rebellion, yet not leaving the guilty unpunished.
It's interesting, at that point in the Bible, generations have gone by, yet God is just now like reintroducing himself, like, this is who I am. And I look at this probably 3,500 years later of like, I still feel like we as Americans sometimes need a reintroduction to God. Like, this is who God is. Meet God, this is God. Now, here's an intimate, sacred relationship with him, because that has actually been lost.
Yeah, and I think so much we distort the character of God, and that's the thing that James saying, like, if you truly want wisdom, and that's not just like this knowledge of what's the next step, this GPS thing, but if you truly want wisdom, it's rooted in the fear of the Lord, who God is and what his character is, and that's what James is saying here. And he describes the person who isn't connected to that character of God and knowing God as someone who's double-minded, but literally it's double-souled or double-nefeshed.
So there's a connection here with pistis faith and bringing that together with the sense of joy and knowing that if you know God, you know his character, this is the pistis faith that you're going to live out, and the result is a life of joy. Not being double-minded or double-souled or anything like that, and goes back to the nefesh way of thinking, that the body of Christ is activated through the hands, the feet, and all these things go together.
Yeah, and this double nefesh thing is basically like he's saying that those who aren't rooted at the foundation of the character of God, of knowing his character, shouldn't expect to hear from God, but it's really because you have a civil war going on within you. And that's really what it is.
There's this platonic soul thing going on, and then there's Jesus. Which one do you want to choose?
So that's basically what it is. There's a civil war. The doubter is someone who finds wisdom, it seems like, in the world rather than rooted in the character of God.
Yeah. So just looking at this again, going back to the way James was thinking. So this is where I think a lot of people read James and they don't enter into a Hebraic way of thinking of this is how James would have done it. But James' view of wisdom, that's the Greek word Sophia, is going to be very different than our Western way of thinking. So he thinks of it as a gift from God. That all these things, wisdom, when I'm a recreated person, I'm given something inside of me, and it might need refining or work or to be trimmed or the branches cut or something like that. It needs action in order to keep building on these things, but it's the foundation of who we are in Christ, essentially. This is what it should look like. And so it's very practical, and this is kind of not... We think of knowledge sometimes as like a storehouse of information, where a biblical idea of knowledge is really like, what do I get from God? What has he put inside of me that I've experienced?
Yeah, wisdom is often, sometimes people put it like acting out your knowledge, but this is more acting out your knowledge according to something that's in tandem with God's character.
Yeah.
The analogy that I sometimes use with my kids is, so knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit.
Yeah, I love that.
But wisdom is knowing that you shouldn't put it in a fruit salad.
Exactly. So this proper action is kind of what leads to delight with the Lord, and really is important in keeping the covenant or keeping our community of sacred action trajectory going the right way.
Yep. All right, so that was the second one of his proofs. So the first one we talked about trials, second one we talked about wisdom, third one we're going to be talking about loving your neighbor.
And this is in James 1, 9 through 11. But the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position, and the rich man is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with a scorching wind and withers with the grass, and its flower falls off, and the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away. Boy, this sounds like something right out of Ecclesiastes.
I know,
doesn't
yeah.
it?
Yeah. So you might be like, well, how's this about loving your neighbor? So James is really addressing the issue of favoritism within his churches, and sees that is their biggest major obstacle to loving their neighbors as themselves. So he'll get more into this, especially in chapter 2, which we'll cover in our next episode. But here, much of this is what we might call the upside down kingdom, or the great reversal. And Jesus talked a ton about this in his ministry, and James is echoing this. But it's also, they're playing off of like the whole mindset of the prophets, of where they call the religious elite to justice because they've ignored the poor among them. Malachi, Amos, Micah, Isaiah chapter 1 comes to mind. Those passages of the Jewish rich, the Jewish hierarchy, the religious leaders ignoring the outcast, was something that God condemned over and over in the Old Testament.
It's interesting. I mentioned Mary earlier, and I'm not going to go all Roman Catholic on you and make her a deity or anything, but she also mentions lifting up the poor and, kind of throwing down the rulers.
Yeah.
I mentioned it in John 2, but you also see that towards the end of Luke 1.
Yeah, so, and also in the Beatitudes, Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit.
Yeah.
Where Luke just says, flat out, blessed are the poor.
Right.
So, yeah.
So in Jesus's parables, I go to like the rich fool, that's Luke 12, and the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16. There's going to be this illustration of the danger of thinking that one is part of God's community by himself without worshiping kind of in a way that God doesn't exist there. And so this is where we kind of get into this communal, almost maybe ritual mindset. And so the rich and the poor are connected here. And I think today in church life, sometimes we kind of forget that.
Yeah. So I believe both the rich and poor here are Christians. Some people who interpret James be like, the rich are outsiders that are persecuting the church, but it seems like from the language here, they're both connected to the word brother in verse 9. Both of them are in Greek, I believe. So, and that's a very Christian term. So I believe that you have rich and poor Christians in a congregation, and there's something going on between them.
So this is where there's a wordplay that might really get lost in translation. Like I've tried to figure this one out more than once because there seems to be something more going on with the text, and oftentimes we wonder, like Matt alluded to, that is this letter specifically towards a congregation here, or does it have a broader spectrum to be delivered? And this is one that I've kind of wrestled with in verse 9 of is this kind of, I would say there is an implication towards all of our churches today, but it also probably has a broader implication to the text. And so today, Matt and I sometimes give the church a hard time and talk about our government, that like we just don't really, this doesn't seem to be a major vibe of our church today. And I really like Mount Zion, the church that we go to, because we do, I think, do that a little better than some. We have recovery programs, we've got a major food pantry ministry, there's things that are set up to go there. But even then, when I think that we probably do a better job than a lot of the other churches, like I'm not sure that we do it the way that is described in the text here. Should this be 20% or 50%? I mean, we don't get around with our Christian friends and say, all right, who do we have, the poor or the needy, that needs to be blessed today?
Yeah. So this poor or humble person should, it says, boast or glory in their low position. And this is not bragging about how just because God blesses the poor and the last shall be first. I think that's a point. God cares for the poor and he cares for the lowly, but I think that James kind of explains in chapter 2, verse 5, he says, listen, my beloved brethren, God did not choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and their heirs to be the kingdom of God. God chose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he proclaimed to those who loved him.
So this gets back to this possessional thing again. This goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning of contrasting, where should we be thinking? Are we in this world, or are we thinking more as recreated spiritual beings? And this is where I go back to say, I wish we had a meter that we could see this every day of like, where are we at right now? Because it's not necessarily saying that you shouldn't or you can't be wealthy, it's really saying, it's really like more pointed towards what are you looking for? Is your possessions taking away from the kingdom of God, or are your possessions kind of adding to the kingdom of God? And I would say most of the time when you hit the level of discipleship, there's no room for possessions anymore.
Yeah.
That's the calling, is that when you finally become a disciple of Christ, you check them at the door. And it may be there for fans and followers and things like that, but like when you get to that place of discipleship, it seems like James is kind of cutting down on any room for hierarchy, saying by the time you're here, you shouldn't have anything anyway.
Yeah. So in the ancient world, riches equaled usually societal status.
Yep.
And wish equaled authority quite a bit because they had a higher honor status in that thing. So what James is cutting at here is the favoritism is really the thing. And favoritism equaled hierarchy in the ancient world. It's not just if you prefer one person over the other, it's that he wants to level the playing field and be like, all right, so there's God and there's man.
Today we actually say we think that we shouldn't show favorites, but in this world that they live in, they would sometimes intentionally show their favoritism.
Yeah. And so it's kind of like the rich young ruler.
Yeah.
And we just mentioned the rich fool kind of thing, but the rich young ruler, Jesus, like he wants eternal life, and Jesus says, well, come follow me. He's interested in relationship and not just him checking boxes. But he says, well, keep the commands. He's like, I have since my youth. And he says, go sell your possessions and he walks away because he had much. And so I think part of it, what James is getting at, is similar to what Jesus was getting at, is that our riches and our self-madeness stand in the way of God.
They do.
And where poor people don't have to worry about that. And so, in a way, they're more blessed.
And getting back to, like, wisdom literature, like, this has a Isaiah 40 ringtone to it, or you might, be almost hearing, like, the voice of Solomon, if you have a voice for that in your head, of kind of saying that, too, because all these things will fade away. And so it's asking to enter into this backward kingdom where the things of the world that they show up here, the way that they should look in terms of favoritism and possessions and all things like that, are actually the exact backward descriptor of what somebody that walks in faith and has real joy looks like.
Yep. All right, so those are the three things kind of that James kicks off, some summary statements of kind of all of his major points. So for the rest of this chapter, in chapter 1, he comes back to those 3 points and digs a little deeper. So we're going to read here James 1:12 through 18, where he's going to come back to talk about trials again.
Yep, and so this is where I've kind of said we had the introduction to James' Beatitude, and this is James' Beatitude, so here we go. Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each of us is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Now, I'm going to stop right here for a second. I think you guys are going to find that when we're reading James, you almost have a whole book memorized, as I said earlier. Like, these are words that you understand. The next one is like this. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. In the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that he would be kind of first fruits among his creatures.
Yep. Like you said before, there's lots of one-liners James has in here. It's very much echoing of Proverbs, these little pithy sayings that you can memorize and just keep with you.
Absolutely. So when he says blessed here, you definitely get this idea of Jesus. And then when you get the idea of Jesus, you go back again, like I've been echoing, to wisdom literature. It's all around it. So the Greek word that's literally in dozens of Beatitudes is Makarios, and it's scattered all over Christian, and the word that introduces them isn't a verb. So this is going to kind of surprise you a little bit, but these are action words. But the thing that I want you to get is it's not really about you. So this goes back to this. It's in you. It's an adjective. Yeah, it's a being. It's describing the bliss that you're going to enter into, the condition of life, so to speak. So the whole point is that this condition is within your control. Matt and I are free will people. And so what it's saying is that you can do this. You can experience an inner core version of bliss, but there's something that comes with this, and it involves action on your part.
Yeah, and so in here, James is talking about trials, and going along with that makarios word, blessed. In classical Greek, it also wasn't a verb. It described the life of the gods.
Yeah,
but going through trials, people wouldn't say like, oh, well, that looks very much like the life of the gods sitting up on Mount Olympus in the Pantheon, right?
Right.
But it's totally upside down.
And hold on to what Matt just said with the gods, because this is going to play into this later too, and really give us, it's something to take heart about. We don't, again, I go back to, you have to think in the way that this was written in the audience it was intended to, rather than reading it with that Western eyes. And this is really important to understand the wordplay sort of going on gods. And this is another, I'd like to point these out because most of our readers aren't reading any of this in Greek. And when I say this is really incredibly written in Greek, this is one of the things that I'm alluding to, is that he keeps coming back to kind of this Deuteronomy 32 idea of the gods, and this is one of those areas.
Yep. So this section here, verse 12, he starts out with, blessed is the person who perseveres, and it talks about the crown of life. And we talked about this in our Revelation video.
The wreath.
Yep, the wreath that goes around. It's some say the victor's crown. So it's for an athlete who persevered to the end of a race and won.
Yep.
And that's really what James is talking about, especially when it's connected to trials and temptations, is the one who pushes through, who finishes the journey.
Yeah.
Like salvation isn't a moment, it's a journey, is what he's talking about. James is fully into that mindset.
This is what you get. You get wholeness, you get perfection, you get completeness. You lack nothing in the biblical sense.
Yep. And so the main idea of this section is Christians shouldn't respond to their trials and temptations by blaming God, but by acknowledging that he is the source of everything good. Like wisdom, it comes back to being rooted in God's character. But the whole thing here is that James is saying that there's an opportunity within trials to either see the joy, that end thing, or to be focused on your situation and turn that into sin of blaming God.
And it's actually kind of got a sexual tone to it, like you've been seduced by it, seduced by the world into that.
Yeah.
So verses 13 to 15 talk about trials, tests, temptations, things like that.
Yeah, so Moose says that what can change a trial into temptation is the attitude in which we meet it.
Yeah.
And when we fail the test, we turn to blaming God, kind of. So there's kind of two options, like we said. We can look at how James started this, to take joy in trials, or we can turn whenever we face something uncomfortable to just start blaming God. Oh, woe is me, why is this happening, you know?
Right.
And so what's the attitude in which you face hard times?
Right. So you got two options. You can either kind of stumble and fall on your face, or you can gain the strength that's inside of you, that's given by God as a recreated person, and you can endure. I love that word, endure.
And so in this, James depicts God not as somebody who wants you to stumble, but he's the one who meets you within that and gives you the strength to endure. And James doesn't claim that that God puts these temptations into us.
Right.
He might allow trials, but it says that God isn't the one who's putting temptations there.
Yeah. Another reason why I like it, because there doesn't seem to be any Calvinist hint in this one. It does sound a lot like 1 Corinthians 10:13, though. No temptation has overtaken you, but has common to man, and God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure.
Yeah, so a lot of this says that temptation comes within us and not from within God. So the translation that we read here says lusts.
That I was alluding to.
Yeah, but I think probably maybe a better translation is desires.
Yeah.
So like the first...
And it's intimate language. That's what I want you to get out of it. So, don't get caught on on too much of maybe a sexual overtone or perversion of the text or anything like that, but it's intimate relational language, which is where he's going.
Yeah, so we would think of lust as a sin. Desire isn't necessarily a sin. It's what you do with the desire that makes it a sin. And so this kind of goes along with James talks about this path that leads to death here, and This is simply anything that has the potential to stand in our way of our pursuit to God.
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot with missing the mark, and that like we always think of these, sin as a huge language when it's kind of described in Matthew as just anything that takes away or steers you away from God. Anything that, if your trajectory is straight towards God and you walk off that cow path in Hebraic mind, then your trajectory is off.
Yeah. So James talks about kind of the cycle of sin here, and that one can almost envision kind of like 3 generations here: the desire as the parent, the sin as the child, and death as the grandchild.
Now, this is an idea that again is rooted in deep Old Testament thinking. There's several places that say that sin sometimes holds for 3 or 4 generations or something like that, and so the idea is that you think that you're plagued, but I think there's also kind of an idea of talking about breaking that chain or breaking that cycle
before it gets there.
That there was this idea of saying that some people thought like they were. This is where cursed comes from. That they thought they were generationally cursed, but the idea is through your own action and decisions, you are capable of breaking out of this chain.
Yeah. Another analogy of this is that there's 3 stages here. The first stage is 3 stages of temptation. First is suggestion or desire. The second is experiment, and then the third is consent.
And again, this is where a Calvinist is really going to have a hard time with it,
because they believe, because it talks after this about every good and perfect gift coming from God, and God is not the one who tempts you. But in the whole Calvinistic system, it's kind of hard to get around the fact that God desired in His secret will for. Like, He set up the dominoes,
It's hard to get there and not make God the author of evil.
Yeah. And there are some Calvinists that just will flat come out and admit, God's the author of sin, where here it specifically says He is not.
So you might be connecting the dots, but when in the introduction we kind of, we're talking about certain theologians that wanted to throw this book out of the canon, you might start seeing why.
Yeah, and you'll see even more why when we get to chapter 2.
Yeah.
So at the end here, James says not to be deceived, verse 16, and again, James is basing everything on God's character, and we see that in verses 17 and 18, that God is only good, and He only gives good gifts.
So there's some language here coming down from the Father of Lights, and so I've been connecting a lot of things, kind of giving the cliff notes of this, but I talked about the recreated, sons of God, the spiritual beings, things like that. So this is the light language that he's kind of bringing in, of that we are going to be grafted into this new layer of light, and this is the way that we should live as those who live in this way of first fruits, bearing that kind of light.
Yeah, and there's a second layer to that, is if you look at the stars, they follow the same patterns all the time. They said there's no shifting shadow in God, so that this connects back to the double-souled person who believes there is shifting shadows in God, who isn't based on the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom, and His character is what's the foundation of all of that. So James is saying here, coming back to that point again, is that don't think that don't doubt God's character and His faithfulness. And
there is so much that we could say here. Like you can probably just see me holding back. It's kind of morning star, and we've never done a video just on the linking the stars and heavenly language to all of it. But I would say that's definitely in James' mind right here, Hebraically, is that he's taking all those things from the very beginning of time among his creatures that are grafted into a more eschatological sense of joy, well-being, fitting into the community of faith.
Yep, and then verse 18 kind of sums it all up. It connects our new birth to wisdom, to the word of truth.
And this is what I was alluding to, the first fruits thinking, 1 Corinthians 15:20.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15:20. Yeah, Christ is the first fruits,
yeah.
And we are a sort of, or a kind of first fruits, as we are reflections or ambassadors of that. And it says among his creatures. Yeah. And this talks about the role of our life is to be first fruits of wisdom and to live life among God's creation and influence that.
And again, it's like, it's so incredibly written in that it has this sense of like being a little disjointed, yet it's amazingly beautiful in the way that it's crafted at the same time. It actually very much reminds me, reading it particularly in Greek, it would remind me of like people that can't necessarily hold normal conversations or communicate, yet they're brilliant.
Yeah.
And you're trying to have a regular conversation, and you might walk away and go, that doesn't even make sense, or I didn't even get the half of it. But then after you think about it, you actually go, oh my goodness, that was amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, so kind of at the end here, James is talking about the whole big picture of trials, which he's digging down deeper into. It all comes back to the way we deal with trials and testings, is we need to remember people are watching.
Yeah.
And so I think he's like, are you basing your character on God? Are we responding to trials in the way, and testing in the way that Jesus did, and how do you imitate him?
Good. Our next session is James 1:19 through 26. This one's a little longer, so I'm going to read quickly. You can pause the video and stop it and read it a little more slowly in your own text if you'd like. This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, for the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. Therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness and humility, receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. But prove yourselves doers of the word, and not merely hearers who delude themselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror, for once he has looked at himself and gone away, he has immediately forgotten what kind of person he was. But one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful bare hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed in what he does. If anyone thinks of himself to be righteous, and yet does not bridle his tongue, he deceives his own heart. The man's religion is worthless. Boy, there's a lot there.
Yeah. So James, again, he's returning to the topic of wisdom here.
Yep.
He's digging into what we had kind of at the beginning and there. And so here in verse 19, he talks about being quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. And then in verses, he expounds on that. So verses 20 and 21, he expounds on what it looks like to be slow to anger.
Yeah.
In verses... So 22 to 25, he talks about what it looks like to be quick to hear.
Yeah.
And then in verse 26, he talks about what it looks like being slow to speak.
And don't forget that this is all premised in how we are to love our neighbor.
Uh-huh.
How are we to live in peace, harmony with each other?
Yep. So verses 20 and 21, he talks about what it looks like to be slow to anger. He starts out with human anger does not produce the righteousness of God, or the wrath of humans doesn't produce the righteousness of God.
Yeah, so righteousness and justice are going to come from the same root word. And this is, again, it's kind of like first fruits thinking going back into it, that we are representative of him who is in us.
Yeah, so this is not opposed to necessarily righteous anger, but again, I think we need to be very careful when it comes to righteous anger, because on a dime you can switch to wrath very quickly.
And so I think there's an implication towards those that are zealots. And, you know, we have a lot of that kind of zealot faith today. So I always want to kind of stop and kind of point to the audience it was intended was probably the zealots of today. We know that not very many years after this, again, it depends where you date it, but they're all going to pretty much die in a big Jewish Roman war because God wasn't in it. You know? And so today we hear a lot of this kind of zealous language for Christianity, as if we're going to
take back America for God.
Yeah, and there's some implications in the text here that I think we need to take heart of.
Yeah, the zealots wanted to take back Israel for God.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that. So God's righteousness comes about by living out this Sermon on the Mount way of life that James keeps talking about. That's the wisdom life from Proverbs at all. It's all intertwined, and it's the way we saw Christ live, the turning the other cheek in love, to go the extra mile for that Roman soldier, to not return evil for evil, which literally is violence for violence, to love your neighbors and pray for those who persecute you.
And again, it's just interesting. I go back to the first illustration I used about Jesus talking with his mother, and we read that very brashly today. We read as if Jesus was the head of his household, and he wants to respond brashly to his mother. And unfortunately, that is the way that Christians live today. That's the personification, where the truth is that wasn't the way Jesus was responding. When you read it in the language and you read those, there's two other words that you get for the way that Jesus responds. One of them is when Jesus is on the cross and he's asking to John to care for his mother, and it's just beautiful in the way that it's tender, yet we've made it, are you ready for this? Exactly the opposite of what the scripture says. And that's what a lot of people do with the text of James, is they've turned it into to try to promote their war in exactly the wrong way that it was written to communicate to the believers.
Yep. And elsewhere in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus deals with anger. He equivalates, he puts anger and murder on the same on the same level.
Right.
And so go back and listen to our series on the Upside Down Kingdom if you want more on there. But yeah, we can see again that if we picture God as this angry, abusive, like, you know, the overthrow type sovereign thing, if we're creating God in our own image, we'll act in line with the God that we've created.
Yeah.
And so James is coming back again to the character of God as revealed in Jesus.
Yeah. So if this is what you think, this is what you look like, that's not the picture of the God that we have. That's not what Jesus looks like.
I think James connects this in the next verse with put aside all filth.
Yeah.
He calls that filth a stain. that type of mindset, the zealot mindset, the way that they want to live and the way they want to live out God's righteousness through that, is James calls it filth.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, that we get the words work out. And Matt and I have talked about this before on videos of working out your salvation. What does that mean? And the idea is this pruning idea again. That some of this hurts. It's like when we exercise today and we're working out, because we all understand that to do it well, it's going to hurt. And there might be sacrifices along the way and things like that. But it's in regard to righteousness. And that's what I don't want you to lose sight of, is that righteousness and wickedness cannot coexist.
Yeah, and it talks also about putting off things, which kind of is a very similar mindset to baptism, where we put on things. We're putting on Christ as a garment, and here it's talking about taking off a filthy garment and clothing yourself with something else.
Now, there's also something that we sometimes like to point out here, and that is that the word for filth is a hapax legomenon. And so there is an element of mystery to it, of not necessarily knowing exactly what it meant, but at the same time, we usually... You know, I'm torn, because sometimes you get the plain reading or the common reading and it throws you into the wrong trajectory. But then other times we get the English translations of it, and it's because somebody studied a lot to get there. And so when we get filth in our culture, I think that this is, again, we don't know for sure because of the hapax thing going on, but when we think of filth, I think that's pretty accurate with what the text is saying.
And it comes back to that holiness code, where those who, and purging, if you go back to our atonement series, like the blood purged the sanctuary of the forces of death, and the filth of the sanctuary, and so I think there's a lot of overlapping language with that, is that when you take off these things, you can get closer in proximity to God. There's these three concentric circles almost with the holiness codes, and when you take off that filthiness and walk in holiness, you become closer to God.
And this is why I mentioned the text on the joy of the law earlier, because this was the whole Old Testament idea, is too many people got beat down by the law, so to speak, and they lost the joy. So they started using the law rabbinically by the time of Jesus. It was legislating all kinds of morality, and that's why Jesus really didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah, because it didn't transform the heart.
Right.
And so that's what James is interested in, is really in the transformation of the heart. Yeah. And that's why the anger of men can't produce the righteousness of God, because it doesn't communicate a transformed heart.
Exactly. Yeah, good stuff. So the word James says that is implanted will save your soul. It's talking about being humble to receive that type of thing.
Yeah. And then when it talks about soul here, like we always have to say, this is not the Platonic version of the pie in the sky, soul flying away thing and it's not, I don't even think that this is talking about salvation in the way that we usually think about it as heaven. That Greek word sozo quite often can just mean healing. He's saying that when we walk out this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' way of life, upside down kingdom way, that it actually not only heals us, but heals around us. It transforms us, is what James is talking about.
So if you've watched our Sermon on the Mount series, you would be very familiar with this. If you haven't, you should probably go watch that. It's really good. But I want you to get out of this that there's a mindset of the here and the now. And this is what evangelical Christianity misses with their salvation language a lot, which is kind of what you were dancing around or alluding to, is that when we get so hinged on salvation, we forget that 95% of Jesus's message was the joy now. Yes, there's an eschatological implication of that, but the direct words were for here and now. That if you live this way in the way that you love your neighbor and interact with each other, this is the kind of joy that you're going to experience. And I hate to say it, but I'm going to sound like I'm like pointing fingers at the church again, but I don't very often see the kind of joy that is experienced or expressed by James here in our churches today.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we were just talking about a little bit ago, the rich young ruler. He asks for, what can I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus then changes his perspective to the kingdom now and walking in relationship and intimacy now, rather than focusing on eternal life to inherit it in the future. Jesus changes his perspective, and he can't handle it.
Right. So he's saying, put aside filth, and that's a precursor to quick to hear. Yeah. So verses 22 through 25, James starts with an imperative to be doers of the word and not just hearers of it. So again, this is backward kingdom language. It kind of sounds like a contradiction to what he said. But on the other side, this is what being wholly complete looks like.
And you have to think like a Hebrew, because if he's saying don't be just hearers, but be doers, and this is his whole section on being quick to hear, what did hearing mean to a Hebrew? It comes back to the Shema, because that word Shema meant to listen, but it didn't mean just to listen, it meant to do it, to love.
So again, this is echo of the Sermon on the Mount. We keep coming back to Matthew 7, but it's repetitive. It's almost like some years have gone by since the Sermon on the Mount, and like
James is molded over.
James is like molded over, looking at the audience, going, "I think you guys need that lesson again." And now we're 2,000 years later, and Matt and I are sitting here going, "I think our church needs this lesson again."
Yep. And so at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, you got kind of Jesus' ending parable of it, where he's summarizing all of it, where he describes the one who builds their house on the rock versus the sand. Building on the rock is walking out that it's not about salvation. It's walking out the teachings that he just taught.
The journey.
He says, anyone who hears these words of mine, his Sermon on the Mount way of life, and puts them, and does not put them into practice, is like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. Yeah.
And this is also, we see it in Luke 11:28, blessed are those who hear the word of God and observe it.
Yep. Being quick to hear is about action based on understanding.
Yeah.
It's wisdom.
So when we read in James 1:2, but prove yourselves doers of the word and not mere hearers who delude themselves, I think it's important to look at that word delude for a second. So the Bible is not about collecting more and more information. And this is where a lot of theologians kind of get this wrong. And this is where I remember when I first met Steve Castle, and, you know, he kind of knew me as a theologian, he almost didn't have any place for me. Like the first time we met, he's like, oh, I don't need to be preached on theology. And today theology almost has a bad context or a bad word to it, because it's people that are collecting more and more information, yet they hardly live it out. Yeah. And so that's exactly what this verse is saying here, is like, that's what of Jesus's day, that's what the rabbis and the synagogues and the Pharisees were known for, is all this cluttered up information, but they weren't acting. And that's where Jesus sets the record straight to come back and said, you guys are getting it all wrong here. Love your neighbor doesn't look anything like the way the synagogues and today's rabbis. And so, you know, Matt and I are involved in this renewal retreat called Tres Dias, and if you haven't been on a weekend, some of you listening to this have been invited. You need to go, and one of my favorite stories I tell is this: clean your room at the end of the weekend, you know, and you guys have been given this whole weekend. Now you need to go clean your room. Francis Chan, it's kind of an old analogy from sermon illustrations going from the years. But I have a new book coming out any day right now, and I kind of have a chapter that's dedicated to cleaning your room based on James, basically, because this is what he's saying, is that in this backwards world, we can get cooped up as the church and get all this information, and almost everybody knows the words. Maybe my kids have a shirt from our school that says, you know, it has this printed on it, you know. And I often have to say, do you know what that means? Don't be deluded by it. Live it out every day.
Yep. Then in verses 23 and 24, he gives this example, this parable of a man looking into a mirror, and when he turns away, he forgets what he looks like. And so James uses this to communicate to people who simply listen but don't hear.
Yeah. It's interesting in 2 Corinthians 3 that Paul uses a very similar analogy of Jesus as the mirror.
Yeah. In his analogy, he said, like with unveiled face, we behold in a mirror the glory of the Lord. Yeah. He's talking about Jesus there. And as we look into it, we're transformed from glory to glory in the Spirit. And he's like, as we look into this word, into the teachings of Jesus, into the life, the mindset of Jesus, we should, as we meditate on that, we should be transformed into what we see. But the person who just hears and doesn't put what they hear into practice is like somebody who looks in the mirror and forgets what they are.
So you kind of have this idea of James speaking to people that they know who they are, they know that what they're doing, but they've completely lost the idea of imaging. Mm-hmm. They've forgotten this. And again, if that message isn't true to our church today, I don't know what is. Like we've got it all figured out. We understand what we're supposed to be doing, but somehow like we're so immersed in the world, which is where James is going here.
We're just box checking.
I've
read my Bible today, check. I've prayed today, check. Yeah. But have you abided in Christ?
Right. Have you found that intimate relationship? And does the fruit look like brotherly love?
Yeah. And he goes on to talk about the perfect law of liberty. So James kind of explains this, what it is in James 2:8, the royal law according to the scriptures, you shall love your neighbor. Yeah. So James just assumes that if you're loving your neighbor, you're loving God. So he leaves off the love God and love your neighbor thing, which is an echo of Jesus saying, which sums up the entire law. And James says here, just the royal law, you can simplify it to love your neighbor as yourself.
Now, we kind of get wrapped up in our Western notion of liberty and freedom and standing strong and things like that. Yeah. But James starts out differently, calling himself a slave, a doulos. Different than the way that we would think of standing strong, being a defender of faith and liberty and things like that.
Yeah, because so kind of we think of our freedom as nobody can tell me what to do. Right. You know what? Yeah. Or our liberty as that. But here, James actually finds true freedom in walking according to the royal law of loving God and loving your neighbor and living out this Sermon on the Mount, Proverbs, wisdom way of life. Yeah. That there's true freedom in that, in boundaries. I kind of use the example, we were on a writing retreat, a songwriting retreat one time, my wife and I were, and so we were given a psalm that we had to write a song after. We were giving a beats per minute that we had to, and we were giving a chord structure. But we could do whatever we wanted with the melody, you know? And it was really experiencing freedom. We had these boundaries, but every group that came back, their things sounded different and beautiful, but we were all using the same chord progression, we were using the same beats per minute, we were using the same psalm from the same translation.
Yep. That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
There's also kind of a thing that people get hung up here on the fulfillment of the law. And so I've mentioned this in the video before, but the fulfillment of the law is Jesus. Mm-hmm. Jesus is going to, if you ever weren't sure what the Old Testament was conveying, or sometimes I even say, like, that was man, that wasn't God, you know, like, you know, that was happening. Like, when Jesus comes, we see all of these things kind of put in a tighter package, and we still, by the book of James, see this as being a problem. And so James is kind of looking out at the intended audience of, you know, recognizing it as the 12 tribes, of saying, like, this is still an Old Testament problem. You haven't quite found Jesus yet.
Yeah, and in Jesus and walking according to his ways is actually true freedom. Yeah. I mean, it's not just go do what you want and how you've been set free type thing, but it's like, here is the way to truly walk out what the Torah was talking about.
Exactly, yeah. And that's really what the law of liberty is
all about. It's not just being free from any sort of law or way to live, but it's like, here are the things that will actually bring you life.
Yeah. So from here he gets into this slow to speak thing, and you know, I'm a very transparent person. If you know me at all, and even in these videos, I sort of sometimes speak my mind. I'm just transparently going, and I like that he says be slow to speak. That's something I pray for and work on every day, and there's a lot of wisdom, like we've been reading, connected in being slow to speak. So if anyone thinks of himself or seems religious, this is a word for religion that we get kind of caught up with on today.
Yeah, so there's a lot of freight and baggage behind this word of religion in our context. We think of religion, especially in Protestant and evangelical world, implies deadness, or liturgy or something like that, where really this word, like, I think liturgy is just a tool. It depends on who's using it. If you're dead or alive, it can be totally bring life and be full of the Spirit. Right. But the thing that James is talking about with religion here, the word implies devotion and it implies worship.
Yeah. So this is thruskos, and I'm going to say, I joke about this sometimes in pronunciation because this wasn't a very common word, even in extra biblical material. Like, it's hard to find this word anywhere. So you guessed it, this is another hapax legomenon. But the interesting thing, this is where Matt and I get really nerdy, is that it's used 3 times in the Septuagint. And so when you're looking for translations, it's found in Job 1:1, 1:8, and 2:3. All 3 times in Job as upright and blameless. And so where I'm going with this is that thruskos, it's a word that corresponds to yar, that's fear in the Old Testament. If it's reverence, respect, honor, this is what I'm saying has been lost today. And I'm going to get into this a little bit more because even though this word is a hapax legomenon, we have the same root appearing later here. And so there's a little bit more that we're going to get into, but it's going to be this idea of ceremonial observance, religious discipline, and again, it's a wordplay. So we'll get into that a little bit more today, but James says that a person that doesn't bridle their tongue deceives his own heart.
Yeah, so we know from the heart, the mouth speaks. And James is talking about a heart issue here as much as a speech issue.
Yeah.
But he's taking both of them, and we kind of see this in like Proverbs 10:19 and 29:20. It talks about a fool being wise when is seen as wise even when his mouth is shut.
Yeah, and that's again why I like to bring out the Septuagint thing, because those words are connected. It's the same words going on there.
Yeah, and James here, this is kind of paralleling the teaching about not just being hearers but being doers. So James pronounces the religious worship of these type of people as worthless.
Yeah. So worthless, teleios, it has different meanings when you get into understanding it, and so some of them are being of no use at all. It's almost idle, empty, fruitless, useless, powerless. And I hate to say this, but people try to figure out where the swear words are in the Bible all the time, which I would say there aren't any swear words in the Bible. But this is one that the world, it would later probably kind of turn into one of those swear words, is say it's totally thrown out. It's like in the toilet, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, so here what James is really talking about is the necessity of orthopraxy, correct action that is based on orthodoxy, correct belief. Said if one has only correct belief, then their religion is worthless if they can't walk it out. And so that would then lead us into verse 27, which we're going to read here, which is basically a summary of the whole thing.
So this is really important. This is when Matt and I use the word trajectory, this is what we're talking about, is orthopraxy and orthodoxy, and that if you don't have the knowledge or the action that sometimes has been imparted into you, as James is saying,
that seed.
The seed, that your belief isn't going to be right, and then your actions are going to be far from the truth. So this has huge connotations. When I look at our church today, and it doesn't look anything like Jesus, I have to go back and say that our orthopraxy and our orthodoxy is wrong. And if that's wrong, some of that is what the scripture here is saying has been built in us as recreated people, which makes me go back to say, have we lost foundationally who we are?
Yeah, and we talk about the importance of theology and how that correct theology is then lived out, or as Scott McKnight says, lived theology, and how important it is. We talk about eschatology all the time, and the importance of having good eschatology has a big bearing on how you live. That's just one example of it.
So this is the second root of the same word, threskia, and this is 127. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world.
So this is kind of the variation of James's third point, which we talked about, kind of the poor and the rich. So he's riffing on that a little bit. So in verse 27, kind of contrasts with verse 26 of what is pure religion and pure devotion. And James lists two things that pure religion are: visiting widows and orphans, remaining unstained by the world.
That's not what we think of as religion today.
Yeah.
And so religion almost has like a bad connotation. So I hear people say all the time, like, I'm not into religion, I'm just into God.
Yeah.
And so I hear that over and over, and it's interesting to try to find where religion comes from. And so even though it's interpreted this way, like I said, the actual Greek word, we don't get religion when James wrote this letter.
No.
And so our English Western version of religion, we're using a different word. This is really important to point out, that it's not the same word. So when we think religion, we're thinking of the word that kind of came with the Latin word. And it is similar. So, you know, that word in Latin, which you're talking 1700, it's a respect for what's sacred, but this is what's really interesting. If you look up any lexicon, you'll see, you know, kind of when the word kind of came about and the source to the 1617. But what's crazy is that it's tied to a reverence for, are you ready, for the gods. It's an ancient context, and you can take this back to, you know, a Greek mindset, if you want to, of all the different gods. So this is where that Deuteronomy 32 kind of view comes in, is it's a bond between the humans and the gods. So in other words, it's our version of religion today comes from a pagan notion of an obligation to the gods.
Yep. So, and this might really be why early Christianity was very creedal.
Yeah, we talk about allegiance a lot.
Yeah. So, allegiance language, it was based on a confession and rituals that obligated a person to a certain set of beliefs and a certain set of actions, a whole lifestyle.
So this is why the interpretation is so difficult, because we know that our Western mindset definition of religion didn't come till many years later, but that definition is going to be based on a Deuteronomy 32 understanding of the gods. So this is where I come back and say, how far off is he? You know, it actually he might be implying the same thing, but where I want you to land on this, where I want you to see it, is that even when he's talking about religion, it's talking about sacred devotion to the God. This is good religion. There also might be a little bit of a wordplay, and this is why I really wanted to point out that we don't know the full meaning of this hapax legomenon word, but when we go back and we see a Deuteronomy 32 view of it, we go back to saying this might be the first time that this is contrasted, that sacred devotion to the Lord has been defiled even within the church.
Yep. And so he gets into what good religion looks like.
Yeah.
So he starts out with visiting orphans and widows.
And we want to say visit, like, you know, in
Go.
our
Go over and say hi.
We're going to go to the nursing home, you know. We're going to sing them some carols at Christmas and give them some milk and cookies, and we're going to leave. But that doesn't seem to be what he's talking about.
No,
here.
so visit here doesn't mean just go see them, but he means to actually care for them.
Yeah.
So we should care for all, but especially what he's talking about is the least of these. Like what Jesus says in Matthew 25:40, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me.
So most viewers, if they're thinking theologically, if they're enrolled in Covenant Theological Seminary as THDs, are going to be questioning us here, saying, how do you know that that's what it meant? And when you go into a Hebraic understanding, again, this is why the Septuagint helps us a lot, because it connects these words. But when we look at the same type of understanding in Deuteronomy 10:18, 24:19, Psalm 146:9, Jeremiah 7:9, Zechariah 7:10, we're going to see the way that in an Old Testament sense you were supposed to care for those that weren't being cared for. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I still come back to John 2 and the way that John and Mary interacted, in that the reason Mary goes to her son, did you know that the word that he uses here is actually the word used for wife? This blows people away, and that's why I'm writing about it for a marriage conference, is that it's intimate covenant words for a way that a wife would speak to her husband. And get this, Joseph had passed away by the time this first miracle was done. So what happens is Mary is looking at her oldest, Jesus, as the man of the household and partnering with them. And Jesus is to take care of his mother. Do you see the circular relationship going on there? This is integrated in here where it's just beautiful intimacy. And this is also the same mindset that James comes from, that we need to have this intimate relationship with the orphans and the widows of the world. Now today, does our church have an intimate relationship with the orphans and the widows of the world?
Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah.
Depends on the community you're part of.
Yeah.
So a lot of this, you just listed a whole bunch of verses, and God promises in all of those that he's going to judge his people based on how they care for, specifically, the husbandless and the fatherless.
Yeah. The helpless society.
The helpless in society. And so the concern here is for the helpless, including those who might make us uncomfortable or demonstrate. We need to demonstrate that our religion is pure. And in essence, James is asking, do you realize that the meeting of needs is not a peripheral thing in the church and not optional, but central and an obligation of your faith?
So I find myself falling short here all the time. So
too.
I'm not just pointing pictures of the church. I'm going back. I got 3 going back at me on this one. So yesterday, it's kind of, the end of Christmas, and my mom is at home, who's a widow, and has this, my youngest, Reed, cut down this giant Christmas tree this year. We couldn't even fit it in the back of my truck, and it needs to be taken down. And I hate to say it, but this wasn't pure joy. It was like, I felt like obligatory that I had to go, and like my wife's cutting down each branch off the tree to take it outside. We ended up being there for 2 hours instead of the 20 minutes we planned. But I will say that what was neat was that my kids were the ones that melted my heart over this. And so we go in there, and I'm thinking 20 minutes obligatory, get this Christmas tree, get out of there, get to the ski hill. But my kids have such a Jesus-like heart for my mother that it turned into a 2-hour labor of love in which I learned something from my kids.
Yeah, that's awesome. So the second part of this is James just doesn't base it all just on caring for widows and orphans, or the least of these. He has a second thing that he goes on, so which is keeping yourself unstained for the world. So he kind of clarifies that social justice is important, but it's not sufficient in and of itself to be true devotion or true religion. And so the second aspect is to keep yourself from the world too.
Yeah, so this is cosmos language, and this goes back to Garden of Eden, of reclaiming, regrafting things, and this is where we get a lot of the world. What are you in the world? Are you not of the world? And this is a major theme in James. So 2:5, 3:6, 4:4. They're all going to kind of have cosmos language and talking about the fallen systems of the world that need to kind of be regrafted. And again, this is Deuteronomy 32 language. This is what it looks like when we are reclaimed, and what it looks like when we're regathering, whether you look at it as a 70 nations periodical timetable, or whether you're saying, Jesus is going to do this, and right now, maybe he's using me in this way, shape, and form, that I'm the hands and the feet of the body of Christ, or whether we're in the waiting right now. You and I go back and forth on this all the time.
So kind of here emerges kind of a perfect example of being in the world but not of the world, where we function as salt and light to the world and to the needy, but we're not supposed to lose our ability to prophetically, speak into and illuminate the darkness.
Yeah, now you and I talk about social justice a lot, and so you tend to be more of a pacifist. I sort of tend to, we're standing right next to a giant gun bolt, by the way, but I tend to be more of the, kind of stand firm, although my interpretation of that is very different than what most people's of it is. But my point in this is that we're not of the world. We're totally different than of the world. We're illuminating what Jesus wants us to do, and we kind of think as our government of the one that takes care of the hurt and needy, as we just talked about. And we also want to look at our government as being the social justice, or the judge. And so, a lot of times, like Matt and his, pacifism sometimes doesn't want to vote and doesn't want anything to do with anything of the world at all. Like, and I'm right there with them too. Sometimes I think I'm just going to live in my bubble, and, you kind of have the, my brother lover, Steve Castle of the world, who's ready to stand and fight for, these things taken. So we've done videos on this where we're contrasting the differences of what that looks like. But where I want to go back to this is that what would happen if we didn't have the government to be the benefactor of social justice?
Yeah, I mean, the early church, for example, Rome didn't do a lot of those things at all.
Nope.
The church, they were the ones who took care of the outcast.
So if they didn't do anything, you would get a lot of Christians saying, well, then I'm going to be the actor of justice. I'm going to make this right.
Yeah.
When what we actually hear James saying in all of this is relax.
Yeah, it should come from the household of God.
Yeah.
Not from the governmental structures or through the world. You contrast the world with that. And kind of the things we need to ask, are we being stained by the world when we try to correct maybe the systems of Babylon by using the ways of Babylon?
Question, yeah.
Instead of maybe wooing the world into the kingdom of God, into the church.
Right.
Are we trying to change structures which aren't going to change because they're part of the wisdom of the world?
So there's a balance, and I talk about a balance all the time in a shalom sense of when we live, there's this idea of living with the knowledge, with what God has imparted, put inside of us, reclaimed us as. That's the part that I think we've lost today, is that that's the part that James is describing as sacred. The part that's been grafted as part of our generational who we are for a long time, and that when we're grafted into this, the result, what it looks like through Jesus, is things like personal purity and loving for all those around you, and the church mirrors Jesus. Yet today, we've lost it, and I'm going to go back and say one of the reasons why I think we've lost it, and this is why Matt and I really like to go back to sometimes orthodoxy, is that we've lost the sacred devoutness, the holy completedness that's being described by Jesus and also James in the text.
Yeah, so like you said, it comes down to balancing these two things. So the reaching out to injustice, to the orphan, the widow, the outcast, and bringing the Jesus way of life into them and lifting them up.
This is the action. Be a
Yeah.
hearer and a doer, and this results in action. But it's also going to take some work. It's going to take
wisdom, too.
Wisdom. It's going to take perseverance. Like, these are the things that are grafted into it, and this is how you work out that every day you might work out and do this well. I have my kids doing 200 push-ups a day. Every single day, my kids do 200 push-ups a day. And what they've learned in doing 200 push-ups a day is that every day builds on the next. Mm-hmm. It's one step that it builds on the next. And if they take 1 or 2 or 3 days turns into a week off, they find themselves that they're way farther back. And so today, one of the reasons why as a church we don't look very good in this area is because we haven't worked it out on a steady basis. Yeah. We haven't persevered to what it looks like, and largely it looks so far away now that we're not even willing to start taking these steps towards it again.
Yeah, so some of the big ideas that we've talked about today is James's 3 big things. So having that our trials are supposed to produce something in us.
Yeah.
It's supposed to produce perseverance that takes out those impurities, like the metal that's heated up and takes out those impurities within us. It's pursuit of holiness.
Right.
Next, it's the wisdom that we're supposed to seek after is the way of Jesus, and it's rooted in the character of God and how you view God. And lastly, this should result in action, that we're supposed to serve those among us, to love our neighbor as ourselves, and that's what true devotion to God looks like, and that it looks like God, it's rooted in his character, and it's totally separate from the world.
Sacred devotion resulting in fruit. May the Lord bless you and keep you.